Welcome to the Working on Wellbeing podcast by the World Wellbeing Movement, the podcast that allows you to be a fly on the wall during conversations with the world's leading wellbeing experts. I'm your host, Sarah Cunningham, and in today's episode, we'll turn our attention to wellbeing public policy. And we'll hear from one of the world's leading experts about why the well-being of people should be the ultimate goal of governments across the world. It's an absolute honour to welcome today's guest, economist, professor, co-author of the World Happiness Report, co-editor of the World Happiness Report, co-founder of Action for Happiness, co-founder of the World Wellbeing Movement, which of course is where I work, and the author of multiple academic papers, but also numerous really accessible books on the science of wellbeing and happiness, including, of course, this latest book, Wellbeing, Science and Policy, which you co-authored with one of the guests from episode 1 of this series. So, Professor Lord Richard Layard, you are so welcome.
Well, lovely to be here.
Well, look, I think a brilliant place to start would be with the basic premise of this book. And I'm going to read a very short extract. You say that the overarching goal for a society should be the well-being of people. And you go on to say, this book argues that other goods like health, family and friends, income and so on are good because of how they contribute to our well-being. So I'd love to know, what are the most compelling reasons why well-being should be the ultimate goal for society?
Well, if you think about many of the things that you mentioned, if you think about health, wealth, freedom and so on, you can ask, why do they matter? So why does health matter? Well, you feel awful if you're sick. Why does wealth help? Well, it helps you to feel comfortable. Why is freedom important? Because you feel terrible if you're oppressed. But if you ask, why does it matter how you feel? There's no answer to that. It's self-evident. Yeah. So that is obviously the thing which cannot be important for any reason other than itself. Yeah. But the other ones are important because of how they contribute to how you feel about your life. How satisfied are you with your life?
I mean, that makes so much sense. And when I think about governments, most governments measure progress by looking at GDP. Now, I know you're an economist, I'm not, and some of our listeners will be, some won't, but I would find it really beneficial if you could quickly define GDP, but also outline why you believe it's a flawed measure of societal progress and why you're advocating for a better measure.
Well, GDP is a measure of the economic activity in a country, the amount of things that people are buying. Yeah. It's about the exchange of money for goods and services. And obviously that's a very important part of everybody's life, the income that they have and the money that gives them that they can spend on buying a decent life for themselves. But in our research, just to be empirical, which is a good way to go at this, if you try and explain well-being by the different things you know about people, their income is one, but their health is another, their family life is another, their work life is another. If you try and explain the variation in a country, in the levels of well-being, income is not actually even the most important thing. So obviously a measure of national income is not measuring the most important thing about a country, which is whether people are flourishing and enjoying and satisfied with their lives.
So well-being is what we should be measuring.
Yeah.
So how would taking a well-being approach change the way in which policies, governmental policies, are assessed, created and implemented?
Well, obviously, you would judge a policy. I mean, imagine you are the finance minister of a country, Chancellor of the Exchequer in Britain, and people are coming to you from education, from health, from transport, from environment. They're all saying you should be doing these things for this reason and that reason. you should be saying to them, no, we are really interested ultimately only in one thing, which is how do these things that you're saying you want to do contribute, and how will they contribute to the well-being of the people of the country. And this is a very, very simple principle where it's a matter of public expenditure. Of course, you would be comparing the effect on well-being with the cost to the government, and you'd be choosing the things which produce the biggest bang for the buck, and the bang means the impact on well-being.
That's so interesting. And I suppose if you were to take that well-being approach, if more world leaders were to take that approach, how would that change priorities? What would be the top 2 to 3 priorities, or maybe the top 2 to 3 policies that might get implemented?
Well, if you're trying to answer the question that I started with, what are the main factors that influence the spread of happiness, and including the amount of misery at one bottom end of that scale? The number one factor is just a very simple measure of mental health. Have you ever been diagnosed with anxiety or depression? That is incredibly important, and of course it's neglected in every country. The treatment of it is neglected. Also, the promotion of good mental health is not well attended to in schools in particular, where society's got a real lever to build robust characters with good values and understanding of themselves and understanding other people and a feeling of empathy for other people. So I would say number one is the treatment of mental health problems when they arise. Number two is the promotion of good mental health in the first place by really rethinking the goals of schools, which have increasingly become purely academic. I mean, no school, of course, is purely academic, and many teachers make serious efforts to help the development of the character and well-being of the children. But this should be an explicit goal of school. I don't think we'll ever get it back into its proper place unless we measure it.
Okay. Yeah.
So we need to be measuring the well-being of children. This is beginning in some school systems in the Netherlands, Southern Australia, Manchester and England. That has to be done. And then, of course, we need school policies that help to raise the well-being, meaning not just the whole school policies, but also specific teaching of life skills in evidence-based ways which are available. So that brings up my number two. Of course, I mean, the biggest thing that everybody is worried about is the well-being of future generations as a result of climate change. So that has got to be higher in everybody's priorities than it is now.
So that's really interesting. So improving access to psychiatric care, which of course is something that you've been very involved in as well. Schools, providing education to children, and also protecting the well-being of future generations, which there are trade-offs, of course, in terms of all of us have to make sacrifices in order to make sure that we are protecting the planet for future generations.
Well, I mean, there's a whole long list, isn't there? I mean, there's well-being at work, which you're very much involved with, and the World Wellbeing Movement is very much involved with. There's well-being in society. Loneliness is a massive problem, and there's a lot that society can do, build up community services, meeting places, old people centres, children's centres, to integrate society and avoid that terrible problem of loneliness. We could go on through a list, but I just gave you those three.
I mean, it's a wonderful list, and actually you're wearing two badges at the moment.
Oh, right.
One is the World Wellbeing Movement badge. The other badge is Action for Happiness. Could you tell us a little bit about the great work that you're doing with Action for Happiness?
Yes, but I wonder if we shouldn't backtrack a second. I mean, the great idea that is behind everything we're talking about is that we judge a society by the well-being of the people. Therefore, that should be the objective of every organization in the society, but also of every individual in society. And this was the great Enlightenment idea in the 18th century that has inspired so many people and has the power to inspire. So when we come to the individuals, That is why we founded this Action for Happiness movement 10 years ago. So the members pledge that they will lead their lives to produce the most happiness that they can in the world and the least amount of unhappiness. And I think this is an inspiring ideal. I think it would fill much of the void of values and purpose that's been created in the secular world, where religious belief is no longer convincing to so many people in the population. We really need a secular ethic. The Dalai Lama talks about this a lot, and I like what he says. So this is a movement of people who make that pledge. But of course, they need to be supported in doing it. They need to understand how to manage their own inner life. They need to understand how other people work, how to help other people, and to have that motivation and capacity to help other people. So Action for Happiness is a movement that provides courses in all of that, but in the end, it provides groups of people who meet together regularly to support each other and be uplifted and inspired, and to regain their perspective, which you have to do over and over again in life, don't you?
Yeah,
Just remember what the most important things are and feel inspired and, in a way, relieved by the fact that there are many things that are more important than the things you worry about from day to day.
Gosh, it's so true. And, you've done so much good in the world through founding Action for Happiness and, of course, the World Wellbeing Movement. But I want to talk more about the individual, because we've talked a lot about governments and we will go back there. But for each and every one of us, for all of our listeners, what can all of us do to contribute to creating a happier world for everyone?
Well, I think it's we have to say, the law of comparative advantage applies, meaning that each person has got something different at which they are most adept.
Yeah.
So you've got to find, if we're thinking about a person's work, for example, you've got to find something which you're good at, but which also you enjoy, which gives you satisfaction. It's not going to work unless it's the combination of those two things. Similarly, in the community, people have different talents. I think volunteering is an important thing for many people, but it's not something everybody has to do, and particularly if they're doing a lot of outgoing work as part of their paid work. Their private life can be a bit more private. So I think that we should all think about what kind of contribution we can make, and this is something people should be thinking about, certainly from their teens.
Yeah.
What kind of contribution am I going to be able to make?
Yeah.
And it's different for everybody. And as I say, it's partly through your work, it's partly through your friendships, it's partly through the community, and of course, above all, it's in your private life, leading a good private life, loving and being loved.
Yeah, we actually had on a previous episode Dr. Kelly Harding, who I think you know, and she gave some really compelling insights into how kindness and social connections can improve both our mental health and well-being as the giver, but also obviously the mental health and physical health of the person for whom you are doing a kind act for.
Yeah, it's amazing that.
It really is. It really is. And I know there's a huge amount of research as well, isn't there, about volunteering, about the well-being benefits of volunteering.
There is.
Yeah. So one of the things which many listeners might want to do, having heard you talk about why well-being should be the ultimate goal of governments across the world, of course, is they might want to say, well, how can I help make that happen? What can I do to catalyze governments to really take this seriously? And I believe that you have a manifesto and a petition that people can sign. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
I would love to. So this was something which we launched at the World Happiness Summit, you were there, on March the 20th, which is International Day of Happiness. And it's a manifesto calling on everybody and every organisation to make well-being its overarching objective. And then we go through the different groups. So there's the government, obviously. We want that to be the overarching objective of government. There's business organisations. So obviously they have to make a profit. They can't flourish and grow without a profit. But their raison d'etre cannot only be that, can it? Absolutely. I mean, their raison d'etre is that they're creating well-being for their customers, for their workers in particular, and to some extent for their suppliers. And it's a great moment that we now have when the US Business Roundtable has signed up to this stakeholder view of business. So business, I don't think they quite use the word well-being, but the justification of a business is its contribution to the well-being of society. Schools also, of course, exist, as we were saying earlier, to promote the well-being of not only their own children, actually, but the people their own children will interact with later in life. That's what a school is about. And then we have the individual. So that this is the manifesto. The slogan is "Put well-being first," and everybody at this Como event, including yourself, signed up to this manifesto. More and more people are signing it now, and we're going to build up to an event next World Happiness Day when we publicly present this manifesto and its signatories. Please go to the World Wellbeing Movement website and you'll find direct links there. But we want hundreds of thousands of people to be signing these manifestos.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Richard. And I couldn't agree more, needless to say. So do please, if you're listening, go to worldwellbeingmovement.org and you'll find all of the details of these, and please sign them. And for those watching on YouTube, we're actually going to very cleverly get our, just below here, get our URL appearing up on screen. So you've talked about, obviously the ultimate aim of this manifesto is for governments to have well-being as their ultimate goal. Of the countries who have done that, so of the countries who have taken a well-being approach, which are the best examples?
Well, New Zealand sort of set the world ablaze a bit in 2019 with its first well-being budget. And I think it was an important moment. They said well-being is the goal of the government. But at that stage, they took a partial step, what I would call a partial step compared with what I was talking about earlier. So they said, we've got some extra money. Right. Let's spend that on well-being. And so they identified some really obvious things, low-hanging fruit, as we say, mental health, child well-being, Maori well-being, climate change, and a couple of others. And that's what they spent the extra money on. They are also part of a group of 5 countries, which includes Finland, Iceland, and Scotland and Wales, which are only partly countries, in the Wellbeing Economy Government Alliance. It's a bit of a mouthful, WeGo, and they are making well-being their objective and discussing the kinds of ways in which they might move towards it. But I think it's important to start by thinking what would be the ideal situation. And the ideal situation is one in which all government policy, not just a few new things we could do, but all government policy is looked at through the lens of well-being. And that's what we're campaigning for and what the World Wellbeing Movement is campaigning for.
Which kind of brings me to the next question, because it sounds to me like there is a science behind how governments might measure well-being and the well-being impact of their policies. And of course, your book is called Wellbeing, Science and Policy. But some people would say that well-being is not a science. What would you say to anybody who says that well-being is not a science?
Well, of course, a science involves measurement.
Yes.
And the breakthrough was when psychologists found that they could measure the well-being of people in a convincing way. So the most common question is, overall, how satisfied are you with your life these days? A scale of 0 to 10, 0 extremely dissatisfied, 10 extremely satisfied.
Yes.
And people give meaningful answers to this question, which can be compared between people and compared over time. How do we know this? The most obvious thing is that it's very well, answers this question are quite good predictors of all kinds of things about people. For example, the answer to a question like that is one of the best predictors of whether you'll be alive in 10 years' time. It's about as good a predictor as a full battery of medical tests. So it's got information content. Wow. It's not a random answer that people are giving. Also, good predictors of whether you'll quit your job, whether you'll quit your marriage. Quite a good predictor of how productive you will be, including from day to day, varying with your well-being on the day. And also, and this is very important from the point of view of politics, it's quite a good predictor of how you will vote and whether you will vote for the existing government. So that should give governments a really good reason to take well-being seriously and make it their objective, because it would help them get elected. I think one of Clinton's aides said it's the economy stupid. Well, it's not. Actually, it's well-being stupid. The economy is a part of well-being, and it's quite significant that the economy contributes to explaining voting. Yeah. But life satisfaction is actually a better predictor of how people will vote in all the recent studies that have been done.
Wow. And of course, when you are looking at the World Happiness Report, you're looking at life happiness scores across pretty much every country in the world. Yeah. Are there countries which are performing higher, which are performing lower?
Well, there's a huge, I think the World Happiness Report, or it's the Gallup World Poll, which it's based on, it's the most profound statement about what is life like for the human race. What is the human condition? It is, of course, incredibly varied. So on this scale of 0 to 10, you've got Scandinavian countries up near to an average of 8. Wow. And you've got war-torn countries in Africa at around 3. It's an incredible scale, which I think corresponds, incidentally, the rankings correspond probably quite closely to how most people would guess if they were asked to put countries in some order of, for example, where would they most like to, supposing they hadn't been born, where would they most like to live? Yeah. And incidentally, you asked me the fundamental philosophical question at the beginning. What is the criteria for a good society? Yeah. And I think quite a good way of looking at it is, well, if you hadn't yet been born, how would you be judging which society you would prefer to be born into? Would it be the richest society, or would it be the society in which people were most enjoying their lives? And I think most people would say it's the second.
It's the second, absolutely.
So that also tells us that these numbers that you were asking about, they are extraordinarily profound descriptions. In history, the movement of these numbers, country by country, will be a central fact of world history.
Yeah, absolutely. Richard, as I listen to you, I feel so inspired. And I know that world leaders, policymakers, business leaders, academics, so many people who've read your books have said that you truly are an inspiration. But what a lot of people would love to know is who inspired you. So thinking maybe about your formative years, were there any people who had a direct influence on you that maybe inspired you to dedicate your life to working on well-being?
Well, I had quite a privileged education, but it always had this element of what are you going to give back? And I remember this famous phrase, of those to whom much is given, much will be required. And I've certainly felt that, one should be trying to contribute to society in whatever way that one can. So then, when I was an undergraduate, I read Jeremy Bentham, and that said what kind of contribution you should be making. You should be trying to create the most well-being that you could. So I've always sort of had that at the back of my mind. So I started as a school teacher, but then I discovered economics. And most people don't realize this, but economics was invented, if you like, in the 18th century to try and answer the question, what kind of organization of society would produce the most well-being? I mean, that's what it was founded for. And what a lot of economists do now, and that excited me greatly, was what they call cost-benefit analysis, which is trying to look at the value for money in terms of benefits measured by what people would be willing to pay. And that's a very valuable thing to do, but it just can't be done for 3/4 of the things that are important to people. And it's just not, you can't get sensible answers about health and so on from that approach. You can get sensible answers about other things. So that's why it is so great that we've got this direct measurement of well-being, which I want all policymakers to adopt. I want also to become part of economics if that could be arranged. Because on so many of the things that matter most to people, there are choices, there are priorities to be set all the time, but they can't be measured by willingness to pay. They can be measured by direct measures of well-being. So the person who first pushed this was a great American psychologist called Edward Diener, who died last year, very sadly. But he joined forces quite rapidly with Daniel Kahneman, the psychologist who won the Nobel Prize in economics, which was quite a feat.
So Thinking Fast and Slow is Daniel Kahneman's famous book, amongst many, of course.
Exactly. Yeah. Thinking Fast and Slow. The last section is about happiness. The earlier sections are about decision making, but of course they're related. Yeah. He influenced me greatly and persuaded me that these measurements had information content and that we really could use them to make the world a better place.
Okay, so it seems like throughout your journey, you've either read the works of philosophers, economists, psychologists. You mentioned Jeremy Bentham, you mentioned Daniel Kahneman. So these are the people who had a great influence on you in terms of your life's work. Now, few people on this planet know as much about the science of well-being and happiness as you do. But what I'm really interested in is, out of all of the techniques that you've come across during your years of research, are there one or two techniques that you apply yourself in your everyday life to improve your own well-being and happiness?
Well, yeah, I've got to know many of these wonderful people, like the Buddhist monk Matthieu Ricard. I got to know the Dalai Lama somewhat. Got to know Martin Seligman, from whom I learned a lot about positive psychology and so on. So, I mean, I do have that series of techniques, some of which I think is like a mantra. You shouldn't be talking to other people about. I mean, I went to Bhutan twice and met one what they call a High Lama, and I asked him, do you have a method for just automatically raising your spirits?
Yes, yeah.
So he taught me one. So I have a method.
So can you share the method with our listeners?
No, you can't really. It's not. But it's. I think everybody should find some method. I mean, obviously the key, perhaps the most important lesson in positive psychology is gratitude, which means essentially focusing on all the positive features of your life, and not denying or suppressing, but just letting the negative ones sit there, without attracting so much attention, as they so easily do. I mean, as we know, we grew up in the savannah, and we were in danger of being eaten, and therefore we're sort of naturally anxious all the time. I mean, we don't need to do that now, and we don't need to focus on the negative. We've got positive things that we can focus on and get on with. So I think that's been very important. I think mindfulness, I've learned as a sort of method of calming yourself, restoring perspective, appreciating whatever you choose to focus on. There are lots of, everybody will have their own method, to be perfectly honest.
But I think it's wonderful advice. And, Richard, you know me, and I've been honest and open about the fact that I have a history of generalized anxiety disorder myself. And anxiety is something that is with you for life. You learn to cope with it and you learn to live with it. And I do every day. I do at the start of every day and at the end of every day, I say the 3 things that I'm grateful for. Right. And it becomes a really enjoyable exercise, actually. I do it with my husband as well. At the end of every day,
really?
The 2 of us have a quick chat. What are the 3 things that we're grateful for today? And sometimes they're silly things and sometimes they're really deep, meaningful things. But I definitely think for me, it helps ground me in the present and keep some of those negative thoughts at bay and remind me actually of all the great things that I am grateful for.
I mean, I think the things one's grateful for, but I think it's also quite important to connect. I think there's a good part in every human being, which we often don't even maintain contact within ourselves. I think I've been very influenced actually by someone called Etty Hillesum, who was a Jewish lady who eventually died in Auschwitz, and facing this prospect, she resolved that she was going to appreciate life to the full, so as long as it lasted, by repeatedly focusing on what she found to be the deepest and best parts of herself. And I think we all have that deepest and best part, and to connect with that is also a good thing, which is not quite the same as being grateful. It's really connecting with some deep inner part of yourself which can help you to radiate outward.
I mean, it's incredible advice. I do want to ask you, we will have listeners who are hearing this conversation who might be actively suffering from either, very serious anxiety or depression. What would your advice be for any listeners who are struggling at the moment?
Well, get the relevant therapy. Get this is really important. Get a proper assessment. You don't want generalized counselling. You want to find someone who is competent to assess what is your central problem. People have multiple problems, of course, because one problem generates another. But the thing to focus on, if you want help, is to identify the central problem, and then get the relevant evidence-based psychological therapy for it. In Britain, we have this, what's now called NHS talking therapies for anxiety and depression, which is on the NHS. Of course, there's also employee assistance. Many people will have through their employer. Different countries have different systems, but I would strongly recommend that assessment. We found in this NHS talking therapies that the recovery rates differ across the services across Britain. But one of the factors that most predicts how many of the patients will recover is whether that service is practicing problem identification. before the treatment begins.
Okay.
And then choosing the really appropriate therapy for that problem.
So that's so important. We're all unique and our challenges are unique. So there is no one size fits all when it comes to therapy. And I know you are a huge proponent of cognitive behavioral therapy, and you've done a huge amount of great work to get cognitive behavioral therapy rolled out complimentary on the NHS for people who are suffering. Do you want to tell us a little bit about the work you did there and why you're such a strong advocate of cognitive behavioral therapy?
Well, actually, I mean, I'm not a psychologist. So the situation in Britain, when I got interested in this, was that we have a wonderful official body called National Institute of Clinical Excellence that recommends, or even specifies actually, what therapies should be provided for what problems, including cancer and so on, within the National Health Service. They were, for most physical problems, their guidelines were being applied. And for all mental health problems, they were not being applied. Most mental health problems, they were not being applied. So, I mean, this is to me an outrage, and I still think that there is shocking discrimination in every healthcare system, in every health insurance system, against mental health people relative to people with physical health problems. So since I had a political connection, I was in a position to say this is outrageous and we've got to get the service going. And then the question is what the service should be. I was very, very lucky to meet up with David Clarke, who's a very leading psychological therapy specialist, and we got a consensus actually on how this should be. It would be to implement the NICE guidelines, which is not only CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but also interpersonal therapy, brief psychodynamic elements of counselling for depression, and also, of course, where appropriate, but for depression, only severe depression,
yes,
for antidepressants, and some medication for some anxiety conditions. But to have this done on an evidence-based basis, provided in services for which people have been trained and are then using the technique for which they have been trained. And we made a big thing about monitoring the progress of the patients session by session, so that we knew what was being achieved. And this, of course, has led to much greater credibility for the service and political support than would have been the case otherwise. And it has now been copied in 5 other countries.
Wow.
So, I think that can hopefully contribute to the well-being of the world.
And that is why so many people think you're an inspiration, Richard. And also, I think, certainly puts to rest any debate. Well-being is certainly a science. I think you've certainly addressed that debate. I'm going to move to what I like to call the rapid fire round. So these are the quick fire questions. If you had a time machine, I always ask this question, by the way, because Back to the Future 2 is one of my favorite movies. If you had a time machine and you could instantly travel to 30 years in the future, what is the change that you would like to see?
Well, I think it would be what we've been talking about, namely a world not driven by the quest for personal success, which is the driving force that our society is offering people. That's what you should be striving for, but driven by people wanting to contribute to the betterment of others. Yeah. So a serious move from excessive interpersonal competition. Competition between organisations is good, but between individuals not so good. Move from that to cooperation as a sort of fundamental driver of how people want to spend their lives.
Amazing. What's the best advice that you've ever received?
Well, I actually think to marry my wife.
Oh, Molly, is that right? Oh, what do you wish you'd learned sooner?
Well, I think that many things, many things I wish I'd learned, but I think I wish I had learnt the practice which Macho Ricard advocates is unconditional benevolence. I think that's a very, very important attribute that we should try to cultivate.
Can you define unconditional benevolence?
What you want is for the other person, whoever they are, to flourish. That's what you want. Including to a degree the person with whom you may have some degree of tension. And I don't think I was brought up to think like that. I don't think I was brought up actually to think enough about how other people feel.
Yeah.
Maybe not even enough to think about how I feel, but of course everybody feels, so that tends to take its place. But certainly how other people feel.
But yet you raised two good points. How we feel, actually for far too long there has been a stigma around mental health. So even when we're suffering, we feel we have to suppress it. And how other people feel, leading with empathy. And as you say, unconditional benevolence, it's such a great philosophy. So I want to ask my final question. For every listener, if there's one thing that you'd like them to do after listening to this podcast, what is it?
Well, I would like them to become part of this movement, to be perfectly honest, and to think of it as something which really can produce a better life for people on this planet. So, please join Action for Happiness. Please support the World Wellbeing Movement. Please, wherever you are, try to spread the message that what you and the organisation are trying to do is to promote people's well-being.
Absolutely. And please go to worldwellbeingmovement.org and find the manifesto and please sign it. Lord Richard Layard, it has been such an honour to interview you today, and thank you so much for joining us.
Well, enjoyed the conversation, and I hope maybe we'll inspire a few people.
Hopefully so. Thank you so much.